Was ist Yiddish und von wann in was gekommen? Hello! Shalom Aleichem! Nice to see you. My name is Michael Rubenfeld, but you might know me better as the Jew of Poland! No? That doesn't work. Or maybe a Jew in Poland. There you go, because I'm not the Jew, because there's lots of Jews in Poland. Not as many as there used to be. Why? Well, let's not talk about that right now, because we're here to talk about something far more enjoyable, the Yiddish language, which is now mostly dead, but when it was alive, it was enjoyable. What is Yiddish? Where did it come from? What is going on? The word Yiddish simply means Jewish, but interestingly, Yiddish was not the original word for the Yiddish language or the Jewish language. That name only started popping up around the 19th century. Prior to that, the language of Jews had a bunch of different names. Teitsch, Yiddish Teitsch, Loshen Ashkenaz, jargon, which is probably where the word jargon came from. It was actually in England where the word Yiddish started being used when Jews started immigrating to England. Or the general understanding of the history of the Yiddish language is that it started in the 10th century when Jews from Italy and France started to migrate to Germany. And what happened is that a language that was a kind of mix of German, a little bit of French and Italian and other Romance languages, and some Hebrew and Aramaic were thrown in there like a stew and mixed all up, and out came Yiddish. It's maybe not as simple as that, but that's basically how Yiddish came about. It was the migration of Jews to Germany, and it's why Yiddish sounds so German, because Jews started using German, but I guess as they were learning German, it got mixed up with the languages that they used to speak or the languages that they already used to study Torah or to read Bible, which is Hebrew and Aramaic. And actually, it makes a lot of sense, and it's pretty cool. It's kind of neat. And some people will say, okay, but there's Polish words or other kinds of words in Yiddish. Yes, that's true. And the reason is because at a certain point, Jews had to then start migrating to the east of Europe, migrating. They were kicked out of parts of Europe because they were blamed for the Black Death, as well as the Crusades. And so then Jews started showing up in Poland, in Lithuania, in Belarus, in Ukraine, and that's when the Yiddish language started to take on some additional Slavic words. And so then the stew got a little fuller, a little more fattening. It's kind of like a good cholent. And ultimately, Yiddish ended up becoming the language that Jews spoke across Europe, although there would be different dialects. You were, say, a Jew from Eastern Europe, a Jew from Russia, speaking to, say, a Jew in Western Europe. Although your dialects would be different, you would be able to communicate with each other. And the ease of communication was the major reason that Yiddish stuck around and became the Jewish language, because it allowed Jews to communicate with each other. Of course, Yiddish was the language of Ashkenazi Jews. And in fact, there were a lot of Ashkenazi Jews who were trilingual in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Yiddish. So although Jews weren't using Hebrew to communicate, they were still learning Torah, which was in Hebrew, and they were praying in Hebrew. They would use Aramaic as the language of learning, but the language of everyday communication was Yiddish. The first record of a printed Yiddish sentence was in 1272, in a machzor, or a prayer book. From the 14th century, Yiddish started being used more often in poetry. And in the 1500s, books in Yiddish started to become published. The earliest Yiddish periodical was published in Amsterdam in the 1680s under the name Courant, which means current. And by the beginning of the Second World War, there were over 400 periodicals printed in Yiddish around the world. Before the war, over 12 million people were Yiddish speakers in the world. Unfortunately, over 5 million Yiddish speakers were murdered during the war, which was a huge reason for the beginning of the death of the Yiddish language. The other major reason is that a lot of people just started using the languages of where they were living. So, for example, there were a lot of Yiddish speakers who emigrated to America or Canada, but eventually English or whatever local language just started to push out the Yiddish. So, say, for example, in my family, my grandmother and grandfather and all of her friends were Yiddish speakers, and that was the language that they spoke together when they first moved to Canada. And it was my mother's first language as well, but eventually she just started speaking English, and by the time it got down to me, no one taught me a word of Yiddish. Well, actually, I learned two phrases because they made my grandfather laugh. The first was Ich will essen, which means I want food. And the second one was Ich will Geld, which meant I want money. The majority of the world's Yiddish speakers before the war were in Central and Eastern Europe and in North America. So in Central and Eastern Europe, there were nearly 7 million Yiddish speakers, and in North America, there were nearly 3 million Yiddish speakers. Yiddish was more than just a language. It was a kind of way of being. It was actually a phrase called Yiddishkeit, which almost means Yiddishness. Yiddish has a particular flavor to it that almost helps to color the lens of what Jewishness is. There's a lot of Jewish stereotypes, like Jews who talk like this from New York, or they have this kind of accent, or this or this. But this Jewish stereotype thing, the Woody Allen thing, the Mel Brooks thing, this comes out of Yiddishkeit. It comes from the Yiddish language. So Yiddish speakers, yeah, they talk like this, and they just use their hands, this. But, then the Yiddish was gone, we lost the Yiddish, but we kept the ness, so to speak. There was major literary figures of the Yiddish world. There was Sholem Abramovich, who was considered the grandfather of Yiddish literature. He actually went by the name Mendel Mechel Seforim, or Mendel the bookseller. And then there was I.L. Peretz, who was possibly the most famous, and he's considered the father of Yiddish literature. And then, of course, there's Shalom Aleichem, who wrote the short story that Fiddler on the Roof is based on, and he was considered the grandson of Yiddish literature. But there is so much more. There's a ton of Yiddish literature that's not been translated. There's Yiddish theater, there's Yiddish films, there's Yiddish folk tales. There is a Yiddishkeit that flows through the veins of the Ashkenazi Jewish people. But it's a strange thing to know or feel that your Jewishness comes from this Yiddishkeit of the past, but to not have the language anymore. I really feel like it's the other part of myself that I've lost, the Polish part, but perhaps even more so the Yiddish part. After I perfect my Polish, my next goal is to perfect Yiddish, or to start learning it. I started at one point, but it was just too hard for me to do the Polish and the Yiddish at the same time, because I just have this feeling like, how can I really know myself without knowing, where I come from? I think that Polish people can probably relate. I think that there is a ness, an oszcz, that comes out of the Polish language. Polish culture is so rooted in Polish language. I feel that I become a different person when I speak Polish because of how the language informs my identity. But imagine being Polish, feeling the Polishness in your body, but not having the language to articulate who you are. I feel in a way like that's how I feel as a Jew. It's this strange thing to only have this language of the colonizer in my mouth. It's the only thing that I actually feel comfortable speaking, but in a way, the English language keeps me as a stranger to myself. But interestingly enough, there has been a kind of resurgence of Yiddishness. There are a surprising number of Yiddish speakers actually in Poland. You can go to school and learn Yiddish in Poland. There's a very good program in Wrocław, actually. But not only has this Renaissance returned to Poland, there's a lot of now Yiddish Renaissance in Israel. Ironically, at the outset of Israel's existence, Yiddish was banned. There was this decision that Hebrew, which was the language of the Torah, would become the new Jewish language. And that lasted until about 1951, 1952. There's no ban on Yiddish anymore. People might say the Israel project was a success, and so I think the Yiddish language no longer poses any kind of threat. And so, there's this renaissance. I think my generation and even younger people are starting to connect that disconnect between the past and the present. And through the desire to reconnect to history, there's this, I think, desire, or this need, for me anyways, to actually be able to use the Jewish language, the Yiddish language. I also wish that I spoke Hebrew, but somehow Hebrew doesn't feel like my language. I don't feel like it's in me. It still feels kind of foreign. But I don't think that there's any kind of sort of spiritual reason for that. It's just because Hebrew was not used in the everyday language, and so the identity of Jewish people was not formed by the Hebrew language. So interestingly, Jews who are not raised in Israel versus Jews who are raised in Israel, raised speaking Hebrew, there is a difference between the kinds of Jews that we are. I'm not talking about Sephardic Jews at all. They would speak Ladino, but that was a completely different subject. Here I'm just talking about Ashkenazi Jews. That's all for me. Thank you for taking the time. Dziękuję bardzo. Shalom Aleichem. Lozim Sari. Ich will Geld. Ich will Essen. I love you. I don't really know Yiddish, but for my play Altenheim, I speak Yiddish, and I had to learn some Yiddish for that play. I don't know Yiddish, or I would just start speaking Yiddish, but I do remember the lines from that play. So what I'll say is, Herr Zachan, verwus geist nicht anpacken die Gens, Jachel helfen. Lass mir tacken nehmen die Gens in Sach, überklappen kann sich roll. Die hast auf viele getracht, wo es kann arbeiten, mir dürfen ausgeben, du ganze Geld gedei und zu kommen nahin. Dann Babet, so lange Jahre, set mich noch nicht überbleiben, die Nessier, a viele Azoyas mit Zimmerchten, darfen bringen zu quere den Babe, Chulle Bechas, efsche et men packen ihr Gift bei ihnen so auf die Vier, in mir Sach, überklappen kann sich roll, mit dem Gift in der Babe. What I said makes no sense in this context, but hell, it sounded good.